Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back once again to the CERCA Monthly Expert Talk. It is well known that we are all going through a serious climate change crisis, and there is an increasing focus on mitigating climate change risks by spend a lifetime on writing about climate change and sustainability issues, and also witnessed at close hand how climate change is affecting the lives of people around the world. We are delighted to bring to you Simon Mundy, who works for Financial Times New York and is the author of Race for Tomorrow, a bestseller that not only narrates the stark reality of climate change, but also offers some hope for the future. Global warming is here now and affecting the lives of people. There is massive investment and innovation taking place into battling the effects of climate change. But what gives hope is that those pursuing and financing these are well respected scientists, engineers, and investors, and who are really serious about their job. Let me once again welcome Simon to this talk. I would now like to invite Professor Jay Dhariwal, Associate Professor in the Department of Design, Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, to introduce the speaker to the participants and invite him to deliver this talk. Over to Professor Jay.
Thank you so much, Hemanji, and hello, hi, Simon. Hope you're doing well. And so, for our participants, we have with us Simon Mundy, the author of Race for Tomorrow, a best-selling book about the global fight to respond to climate change. Simon spent nearly 2 years traveling through 6 continents and 26 countries to tell the stories of the diverse cast of characters locked in this historic struggle, from communities hit by extreme physical shifts to business leaders grappling with the implications for the world economy. Born in the UK, he has reported for the Financial Times since 2010 and was recently appointed Moral Money Editor, covering the push for a cleaner and more sustainable world economy for the award-winning Moral Money platform and across the wider Financial Times. He started his career in Johannesburg, where he joined the Financial Times to cover Southern Africa. After a stint as a corporate reporter in London, he spent 7 years in Asia, heading the Financial Times bureau in Seoul and then Mumbai. Can't wait to listen to you, Simon. Over to you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for taking the time to hear more about my book, Race for Tomorrow. So I was actually based in India for 3 years, from 2016 to 2019, as the FT's Mumbai correspondent. I'm here in the FT's headquarters now in London. You can see the lifts going up and down behind me, but my background has been mainly as a foreign correspondent. So as our host mentioned, I joined in Johannesburg. I then spent 4 years in South Korea. And then I moved to India in 2016. And it was actually in India that I really had the germ of the idea for this book. Very soon after I arrived in India in March 2016, I did a reporting trip to an area called Marathwada in Maharashtra state. So I got the night train to Latur from Mumbai, and found myself the following morning at the center of one of the worst water crises, really, certainly in India, and arguably, you don't find water crises much worse anywhere. So what I found there was farmers who were really struggling. This had never been a very prosperous area, and it's always been a somewhat dry area, but this was unprecedented. Farmers were now struggling in an altogether new way to produce any sorts of crops. Many of them were having to give up farming. The suicide rate, appallingly, was spiraling out of control in this area of Maharashtra in particular. And when I looked at the rainfall charts and when I spoke to meteorologists, it was very clear that this was not just the normal sort of fluctuation that had happened from time to time. This was climate change. This was a structural, long-term change that's been coming into play over the past couple of decades, where the rainfall in that particular area of India was coming down. And this was very shocking for me to see it, to walk on the floors of these reservoirs that were completely drained of water. And while I'd always been interested in climate change, something about that reporting trip woke me up to the fact that I had been seeing it way too much as a sort of slow burn, long-term thing that my grandchildren would have to grapple with in a serious way. This is happening now, and it's ruining people's livelihoods now. And as I was to discover in my book research, the impacts are incredibly diverse and to be found in every part of the world. But I didn't have the idea for the book right away. I was busy with other things, but I kept on thinking about climate change. And then later that year, I had a really interesting conversation with somebody who worked in the publishing industry. And this person said to me, just in passing, yeah, people aren't really that interested in books about climate change. People don't tend to buy them. And I thought, well, that's interesting because there's no obvious reason why that should be the case. It's not an obviously boring subject. It's not an obviously dry or dull thing. And yet people had been getting put off the existing books on climate change. And I started reading some of them and trying to understand why that should be the case. And I realized that some of them are really excellent, I should say. But I realized that many of them had one thing in common, which is that they were somewhat lacking in human color. They were often gave the reader the sense of being preached to, perhaps in some cases. And they could just seem, the subject as a whole can feel very overwhelming. It's huge, it's so complicated, and it's been politicized. So you have people on various sides of the debate sort of shouting at each other and impugning each other's integrity and so on. So I'm a reporter, I'm not a commentator. My work and the experience and skills that I have are about finding things out, speaking to people, seeing things and describing it without putting too much of my personal opinions in there. And I thought that was the approach that I would like to take to this. And it occurred to me maybe there was scope for a different sort of book that simply tried to do justice to the extraordinary color and drama and tragedy and inspiration and the incredible range of facets that there are to this story, because it is simply coming to it as a reporter. This is simply the biggest story there is. The more I looked into it, the more I realized that this affects every single aspect of the modern world. Of course, there are the physical impacts and the humanitarian impacts of these things that we see happening, from drought to typhoons, all sorts of natural disaster. But then beyond that, you have so many other impacts when it comes to how the global economy operates, global business, the balance of power between nations. So the idea that I wanted to pursue for the book was to describe this unprecedented set of stories through on-ground reporting, old-fashioned on-ground reportage, getting on the ground, wearing out my shoes, meeting people who had incredible stories to tell, and that's what I set out to do. So I ultimately ended up traveling for 2 years full time, as well as trips before that. It took me to 26 countries altogether. And I found some extraordinary stories, met some extraordinary people, just some of which I'll describe for you here today. So I'm going to pull up, I took a lot of photographs as well as videos during my travels, which you can find on my website, simonmundy.com, my YouTube channel, Instagram. You'll find a lot of the content there. But in the meantime, I'm going to share my screen and just share a few of those, few of these stories and images with you. So let me pull this up. So I hope you can see the photographs. Can you see it?
Yes, yes,
You can. Fantastic. Okay, so this was the very first place that I went on my travels. I went to Siberia. Now, I've never seen anything like this before in my life. I don't know about anyone in the audience. I certainly hadn't. So what the hell is this? Now, Siberia is enormous. Most of Russia is constituted by Siberia. It's everything to the east of the Ural Mountains, and it gets over, of course, almost to Alaska. And a very large proportion of Siberia is permafrost. Permafrost, that simply means frozen ground. And this is ground that has been frozen solid since the end of the last ice age, many thousands of years ago. And frozen within the permafrost is organic matter. It's basically the remains of ancient plants that have been frozen solid, much like if you put food in the freezer, it just stays there. It doesn't rot. As long as it stays frozen, it will be preserved inert. But if you have a power cut for a couple of days and the freezer goes off, you'll find the food starts to rot and it gets pretty smelly because microbes are going to work breaking down the food in your freezer. It rots and it gives off gas. And that's exactly what's happening across swathes of Siberia. As global warming gathers pace, you have enormous areas of land where the permafrost is thawing out. And what happens then is that microbes go to work and they release enormous amounts of carbon dioxide and methane that is still more potent as a greenhouse gas. So I went to Siberia and I found myself at this place called the Batagayka megaslump, which is the biggest phenomenon of its kind in the world. This is deep enough to fit the Sydney Opera House inside. It's nearly 2 kilometers wide. Walking through it, I could hear the crater expanding. There were enormous blocks of earth just crashing down from the sides of it. And it was a pretty scary thing to see because the permafrost zone of Siberia is the size of China plus Afghanistan plus Nigeria. So the potential emissions from the Siberian permafrost are absolutely enormous, and it's already begun. So this is an example of how dangerous a game we're playing with the global climate. We are messing around with a system that even if we were to be able to get down to net zero industrial and agricultural emissions, we risk setting in place feedback loops. We risk messing around with natural systems to the point where they start driving carbon emissions, even if we were to stop, which is a very scary prospect. But for a significant number of people in Siberia, in Yakutia, which is this area of Siberia that I went to, the thawing of the permafrost actually looks like a positive thing. So this picture I took at the camp of some illegal mammoth tusk hunters. So as the permafrost thaws, growing numbers of men in Yakutia are heading out to very remote areas to look for mammoth tusks, which are emerging from the permafrost, and they can sell them to Chinese traders for very large amounts of money. These tusks are then finally engraved and often end up in expensive hotels in Hong Kong or casinos in Macau. And so I took a long journey through down a river on a tiny little boat. It took about 15 hours to get there. And when I discovered these hunters, they were claiming to be just fishermen, but finally they admitted what they were actually up to, because it's illegal to look for these tusks in the way that they're doing. They're sort of putting the thaw into overdrive by blasting away at it with water pumps. But they were finding a significant number of tusks. They were also finding bones like this. So this is the hip bone of a mammoth, which I found and picked up. The hunters had no interest in that, of course, because they were just after the ivory. But this was, the remains of a woolly mammoth that had been there under the permafrost for tens of thousands of years. But now with the accelerating thaw of the permafrost, these things are all being exposed. But I then, at the very end of my trip to Siberia, I went and stayed with this man, who is probably the most eccentric scientist I've come across. His name is Sergei Zimov, and he's a very well-known Russian scientist who, for a long time during the Soviet years, he worked in Siberia, in the very far northeast of Siberia, in a region called Kolyma, which was most famous for its prison camps during the Stalinist years. But he was up there to study the local biology. And then when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, they told him to close down the camp and move somewhere else. But he refused. He decided to stay there under his own initiative. And the reason was that he was making some really interesting findings about this area of Siberia. So one of those was that many, many years ago, he found this area of Siberia, which now is covered in forest. It actually used to be roamed by animals. It was grassland roamed by animals. So it was a very different sort of ecology. And he later was one of the first scientists who discovered that the permafrost was thawing and that this could have very serious implications for the climate. So what he's now done is sort of put these two theories together. And he has come up with what he says is a really important way to protect the permafrost from thawing. And that involves trying to return the biome to the way that it was during the Ice Age, to restore the grassland. Because while forests are very important and valuable in the tropics, Zimov argues that in the Arctic region, actually, you don't want forests, you want grassland. Forests are darker, they absorb more heat, and they lead to faster thawing of the permafrost. With grasslands, the permafrost can be more protected. So he's set up something that he calls Pleistocene Park, the name openly modeled on Jurassic Park. But he's seriously trying to prove this theory. He's restoring the grassland. He's brought in large numbers of large mammals to fertilize it and roam it and graze it. And eventually, he's hoping that he will be able to have mammoths walking around Pleistocene Park. So there's one of the world's leading genetic scientists at Harvard University called Robert Church is working on altering the genome of the Asian elephant to create an artificial woolly mammoth. So you would effectively have a mammoth that has been genetically engineered into existence. And Church has promised that the very first of those mammoths will go to Zimov at Pleistocene Park. So, sorry, just need to load up the presentation again. I'm sorry, the screen sharing appears to have had a glitch. Please just give me a moment. Okay. Right. So the melting and thawing is not just happening in Siberia, of course. In the mountains of the Himalaya, as elsewhere, the glaciers of the world are melting at an accelerating and quite terrifying pace. So this is a glacial lake to the about 50 kilometers to the west of Mount Everest. It's called Chorolpa. This is the biggest glacial lake in the Nepali Himalaya. And the extent to which and the speed with which these lakes are growing, I found utterly terrifying. It took me about 5 days to hike up to this place. And all of this, you see this lake, all of this was a glacier. And it's now retreated so far. You can see at the very end here that sort of stump of a glacier at the end of the lake. The whole valley used to be filled by that glacier. The glaciers are retreating. The world's glaciers are shrinking at a pace of 350 billion tons per year. That's 10,000 tons a second. I think of all the statistics that I discovered during my research, that was the single most extraordinary and terrifying. So this obviously is having a very powerful impact on sea level rise. The glaciers so far have been one of the biggest drivers of this. But it's not just a danger in terms of sea level rise, but for the communities who live near these glacial lakes, it's extraordinarily dangerous. And speaking to the people who lived beneath this particular one, it was quite extraordinary to see how they had just decided to live with it. It was something that they ultimately had no choice. It was mostly elderly people living there. But as I saw, and you can read about it in the book, I visited another community that had already been devastated by what's called a glacial lake outburst flood, or GLOF. And there are 5,000 of these glacial lakes scattered across the Himalaya. They're all growing, and it's a serious danger. Another place where I learned about the impact of melting ice was Greenland. So this man is called Rasmus Christiansen, and he's a member of the Inuit people. So I stayed with them in a place called Qanuq, which is the northernmost village in Greenland. It's right up, sort of, approaching the North Pole. And these people have, for many, many centuries, their culture has revolved around dog sleds and hunting on the ice. They arrived in Greenland with dog sleds, crossing over the ice from Canada about 800 years ago. But now, increasingly, their culture, their ice-based culture, is changing. So for more and more of the year, they are hunting, as you can see him doing here. He's on a boat here. He's not on the ice, of course. This was in the summer. He's out hunting on a boat, and this is for more and more of the year. Their dogs are tied up, howling, and this is the erosion of a traditional culture, and people have mixed feelings about it. Some of them are very sad about it. Others are saying, well, you know what, I quite enjoy hunting on a boat. I don't need the dogs. Some of them are quite unsentimental about the changes. But another thing more broadly, as you'll read about in the book, if you read the book, is that there is a potential economic bonanza for Greenland, because as the ice melts, the mineral resources of Greenland are becoming more and more accessible. So when I spoke to the mining minister of Greenland, he actually said to me explicitly, he said, culturally, the melting ice is a disaster, but economically, it's a big positive. And this is something that I think we have to be quite clear-eyed about, that there will be winners from climate change. And of course, Russia is also paying very close attention to the melting ice. I also, as I described in the book, visited a Russian Arctic port where, again, the head of the port was very excited about climate change. He was saying, there's going to be more and more shipping through the Arctic. If you want to go from Asia to Europe, let's say from Korea to the Netherlands, the route going along the northern coast of Russia is actually much shorter than the route going through the Suez Canal. And more it's becoming feasible to operate. Already quite soon after my trip to Russia, Maersk, the big shipping company, sent the first ever container ship through what they call the Northern Sea Route along the coast of Russia. So the geopolitical implications of all this, especially in an age of growing tension between the US and Russia and China, which is also trying to position itself as an Arctic power, despite its distance from the Arctic, this is going to be a very important area of competition. And you can read about that in the book, including an interview with a senior State Department official from the US who gave some thoughts on that. So as I mentioned, the melting of this ice is driving up sea levels already and will do so more and more violently in the years ahead. This is a photograph I took in Venice, and this yellow structure that you can see is called Mose, and it's one of the most controversial engineering projects in European history. It's cost billions of dollars. It's taken decades to put together, and it was at the center of one of Italy's worst ever corruption scandals. So several years ago, the police arrested a whole swathe of the Venetian elite, both business and political, including the mayor of Venice was invested as part of this, because as the story goes back decades, when the authorities of Venice decided we need to have better protection for the city against flooding. And then, of course, when the implications of climate change were realized, the project became more urgent. Large amounts of money were put into this barrier, where these yellow barriers, they stay beneath the seabed and they're raised to protect against a sea surge when it comes in. It's these periodic storm surges that are becoming more dangerous. And when I met a man called Alberto Scotti, who was the architect of this this project. It was his vision to start with, and he was so infuriated. He's now an old man. He started working on this project in the 80s, and he was so disgusted by the amount of corruption and graft that had undermined this project. Fortunately, at last, the thing did finally get built, and I was there actually. This was the very first time they raised the barrier, and of course, Alberto Scotti was there as well to see his vision made real. But the amount of money that was wasted and indeed stolen as part of this is a real warning sign, because we're going to see enormous amounts of infrastructure investment needed all over the world to protect against the impacts of climate change. And that will come if we don't deploy that money with the appropriate level of rigor and transparency. Then there will be opportunities for a lot of that money to be wasted or indeed embezzled and stolen by bad actors. So lessons for all of us from that story, which again, you'll read much more about in the book. This is a photograph from Dhaka, Bangladesh. So the lady on the right is Morgina, and this is her home. She lives in a corrugated iron shack in a slum area called Banyabad in Dhaka. And again, this is a very worrying sign of things to come, I believe. Bangladesh, people talk about the potential for Bangladesh to end up underwater. Certainly, there are, if sea level rise continues at the pace that it's expected to, then yes, there will be significant areas of coastal Bangladesh that will be inundated. But I think people don't pay enough attention to what's already happening in Bangladesh, which is not so much about areas of land disappearing underwater, but the real issue here is the infiltration of salty water into farming areas, rice land, traditional rice growing areas in southwest of Bangladesh. And it's now becoming harder and harder and harder for people like Morgina's family to live in the way that they always used to, which is by growing rice. So you're increasingly seeing that paddy areas, rice paddy, is being turned into shrimp farming land, which is still productive and makes money, but it only makes money for a relatively small number of people. Rice farming is labor intensive. Shrimp farming, you don't need that many people to work on the land. So what you're increasingly seeing is people like Morgina are selling their land to shrimp farmers, and there is no work for them anymore, because the shrimp farmers, these are often wealthier people. The biggest of them, they don't even live in the area. And I met one of them. He was in the area at the time, but he spent about at least half his time in Dhaka, a very wealthy man. who was making his money from shrimp farming, and he was saying, look, this is the future of the area. There's no future for rice farming, so we just have to make the best of it. And some would argue that he's right. But in any case, what this is leading to is an enormous exodus of migrants to Dhaka in particular. People like Morgina in enormous numbers. Dhaka is the most densely populated big city in the world, and it's becoming a more and more serious crisis. So we need to pay more attention to the migration problem in Bangladesh in particular, but also we need to think very carefully about migration elsewhere within developing countries, which will be most of it, but also the implications for politics, I would argue, in the developed world. We've already seen how extreme nationalist far-right groups in Europe in particular have seized upon migration crises, notably from Syria, to stoke racist and xenophobic politics. And I think we can expect more of that as climate refugees become a bigger and bigger issue. You can expect fascist politicians to try to take advantage there. So it's not just an issue for developing countries. We should also think about the issues, even for those countries that might be less badly affected by the direct impacts of climate change. Climate justice is another issue that is very prominently featured in the book, and particularly in the Solomon Islands, which is a country to the east of Australia, to the far east of Australia, down in the South Pacific. It's a very remote place, difficult to get to, and this island is called Nuatambu. This is the chief of Nuatambu here, Maso, who I met right when I arrived, actually, from having taken the boat from the provincial capital. He happened to be standing on the wharf of the island when I arrived, and when I asked if I could stay to research the situation there, he said he'd have to summon a meeting. So he blew a conch shell to summon a meeting, and the villagers came and they voted on whether I should be allowed to stay and listen to their stories and hear about their community. And there was a vote, and the verdict, not unanimous, but the verdict was that I would be allowed to stay. One reason why some people were a minority of people didn't want me to stay. And I later found out the reason for that was that people felt betrayed by the wider world, especially people from the rich world, because they were aware of what was causing the progressive inundation of their island. This island has been split in two. So the spot where Maso is standing in this photograph used to be the center of the village. And it has been progressively washed away. So people are being forced up into the hills. As you can see, there's this, both halves of the island have a hill where you can go and live, but the community has been broken apart. And people were very conscious of the fact that this is a crisis that has been driven by the rich world predominantly, but the rich world has not been providing that financial support to them to deal with the problem. This was also a problem for the provincial capital of this province called Taro, which you can see here, Taro Island. I took this photograph with a drone. Unlike Nuatambu, Taro doesn't have any hills. Taro is dead flat, and Taro is disappearing. Much like the Maldives, another country featured in the book. The Maldives is an entire country that will ultimately end up underwater, and these issues I address in more detail in the book. And the issue for Taro, they've been trying to move this whole village. They want to move to a more secure site on a larger neighboring island, and they can't afford it. They don't have the money. So the argument of the provincial leaders, including this man, Isaac Lekalalu, is that the rich world should cover the costs. It is the developed countries predominantly that have been driving this crisis, creating this situation for people like the inhabitants of Taro, and they should be covering the cost. But the problem is, it's very complicated, at least in the eyes of the donor countries, to fund this kind of adaptation. So if you look at climate finance, it's divided into mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation refers to clean energy, so mitigating emissions, reducing emissions. Adaptation is helping people to adapt to the impacts. And the vast majority of climate finance so far has gone towards mitigation, towards renewable energy. But people like Isaac, who's trying to to mastermind this movement of the community, and he's pictured here at the proposed site of the new place, they're not getting the money that they need to pursue that, and there's no sign that they will really have any breakthrough anytime soon. So this question of climate finance and the deeper question of climate justice, of course, this is something that was addressed very prominently at COP26, the climate conference, which I attended last November in Glasgow, and you can expect it to be a bigger and bigger issue going forward. And when it comes to these issues of justice, this was very strongly and poignantly demonstrated for me in the Amazon rainforest of Brazil. I spent several weeks there looking at what was happening on the ground in the world's biggest rainforest, one of the world's biggest carbon sinks. And this photograph was taken within the indigenous territory of an indigenous group called the Uru-Ewawau. And these are two young members of the tribe. There are fewer than 100 members of this tribe left. There used to be several hundred. They used to live until the 1980s, when these two guys were born, around that time. Until the 1980s, the Uru-Ewawau lived in total isolation from the rest of the world. They had no contact with modern Brazil. Then the modern Brazilian government decided that they should be brought into contact. So many of them died right away from modern diseases. They had no immunity against them. And then they started being murdered by people who wanted their land. And these people want their land because predominantly it's for the purposes of raising cattle in order to sell beef, both domestically and to the international market. So Awapu, on the left here, he's the leader of a group of young members of the tribe who are trying to fight back. They're trying to protect their forest, and they really are risking their lives. A few months before I arrived and met Awapu and his friend Tebu, who's on the right, Awapu's brother-in-law, Ari, and his fellow sort of co-leader of this group was murdered, was stabbed to death by the people who are trying to invade their land. And the problem is that one thing that's driving this is the stance of the current Brazilian government under President Jair Bolsonaro, who has openly called for the greater economic exploitation of the Amazon. And he was once quoted saying in Parliament, "It's a shame that the Brazilian cavalry was not as efficient as the American cavalry who exterminated their Indians." So this is the president of the country. This is the environment that's being created there. And when I met people, I met people that there's one person who I featured in the book called Ezio, who was openly burning down a section of rainforest. He was happy to be photographed. He was happy to be filmed. You can see him if you go to my YouTube channel or my website, you can watch the video. You can see an interview with him. He was very comfortable being interviewed in the process of burning down the rainforest, because that is the level of impunity that has set in. This is a disaster for the climate already. There's the potential for the Amazon to, again, for a potential tipping point to take hold, where the Amazon actually starts shrinking under its own momentum, according to the Brazil's most prominent climate scientist in this field, who I featured in the book. So hugely alarming there. And what's ultimately driving this is the meat industry. This land is being cleared so that cattle can be raised for beef. So what do we do about this? Well, this man has what he says is part of the answer. So his name is Didier Toubia, and he's the chief executive of a company in Israel called Aleph Farms. And this is one of a growing number of companies that are developing what's called alternative protein. Some people call it fake meat. There are two basic forms of fake meat. One of them is plant-based. So you might have heard of Beyond Meat. They provide plant-based burgers to Burger King, or Impossible Foods. I'm sorry, Impossible Foods provides the Impossible Whopper to Burger King, and Beyond Meat is their rival. So Impossible Foods is the plant-based company featured in the book. I visited their operations in California, and there are some wonderful, colorful details that you can hear about there, about the process that went into their burgers. But this is different. Didier's company is what's referred to as cultured meat. So this is actually growing meat from cattle cells in bioreactors. So rather than producing a burger, they're actually trying to produce steaks. They're trying to grow muscle and fat, and it's all based on medical technology. So you'll read in the book an interview with Shulamit Levenberg, who's one of the most prominent scientists in the field of heart medicine, high-tech forms of treatment for cardiac patients. So she found a way to grow human heart cells to produce tissue that could be used to help people with heart disease. And then someone said to her, well, that's great. How about you also do the same thing with cow cells to make beef? And the reason why, I mean, this might sound, a lot of people would be quite squeamish about this and think it sounds quite creepy. But the point is that at the moment, the global beef industry is devastating the world's rainforests. There's also the impact of methane emissions. It's one of the world's biggest sources of methane, predominantly from the burps that cattle give off. So if you can grow this beef in bioreactors, you don't need to destroy the rainforest. You don't have the methane emissions. Also, according to Didier, it can be healthier. You don't have the antibiotics that are pumped into modern beef cattle. So at the moment, his steaks are much more expensive. He's adamant that in the future they could be cheaper because the process could be so much more efficient. You're only growing the steak. You don't have to grow the cow's eyes and hoofs and digestive organs and all the rest of it. So there's a lot of excitement in this field, and I think it's one to watch. It's not on menus yet, but I personally would imagine that it will be in the future. So Didier, this is one of a number of quite exciting startups that I visited during my research. I don't have time to describe all of them to you here, but I want to flag a few of them. This is a man called He Xiaopeng, and he's one of the most prominent Chinese clean tech entrepreneurs. He made his billions as the creator of UC Web, which is a very popular mobile browser. And his company was acquired by Alibaba. He had a very prominent job with this enormous Chinese e-commerce company. And then he decided, e-commerce, that's nice, but I really want to if I really want to maximize my impact, I want to do something about climate change. And the way he decided to do that was through this electric car company. So he started, like Elon Musk at Tesla, he started off as an investor, and then he became the CEO. And Xiaopeng Motors is really trying to take the game to Tesla. They're trying to produce high-end premium fast cars. I drove one of them before it was actually on the market at their headquarters, the car that you can see here, the P7. And this is one of several Chinese startups that I visited active in the clean tech space. BYD that you might have come across, it's an absolutely enormous company. Another one called Envision Energy. And I was really interested to see the extent to which these entrepreneurs really saw, they really believed that this was now a core part of Xi Jinping's national economic strategy. Yes, as everyone knows, China is the biggest carbon emitter at the moment, enormous amounts of coal power, but in the long term, everyone I spoke to in China was saying, look, isn't it obvious that this is an opportunity for China to become a real global leader? If China is the leader in new energy, in electric cars, in solar, in wind, in battery storage, and all these technologies that will be central to the new economy, then that will make it truly powerful this century. And that seems to be, where a lot of people in China are placing their bets. But they have competition, of course, from people in the US. So this is a man called Bob Mumgard, who I visited at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. And he is a nuclear physicist at MIT. He's one of the leaders in his field. But he's now become a startup entrepreneur, developing what he says is going to be the world's first commercial producer of fusion power. Now, fusion power, it's a very different thing to nuclear fission, which is what most of all of the nuclear power that we have today is. Nuclear fusion would be dramatically cleaner in terms of, minimal amounts of radioactive waste would be left over, and incredibly productive in terms, the inputs. You simply need isotopes of hydrogen, the most abundant element that there is, and incredibly potent source of zero carbon power. So he's actually posing here with one of the old experimental fusion reactors at MIT. When this thing was switched on, it was the hottest point of the whole solar system. It was hotter than the sun, 100 million degrees. It could only be switched on for a fraction of a second, and only with the agreement of the local electricity authority. And the reason for that was because it required enormous amounts of power to generate that fusion reactor. It generated much less power than it took in. But what Bob says he's going to create is the opposite, a fusion power reactor that will actually produce net power. And it sounds outlandish to many people, but just a few months ago, Bob raised $1.8 billion from investors to pursue that project. So a significant number of people with a lot of money between them believe that he's got a chance of pulling it off. If he did, this would be a game changer for the global energy industry and for the global climate struggle. I want to finish. I want to finish with a story from Congo. Before I do, I want to mention this project, which I think is really important. We talk about net zero, net emissions. So the one side of that is negative emissions. It's about reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is one of the most interesting companies doing that. This is a joint venture that I visited in Iceland between Carbfix, which is an Icelandic startup. Edda in this photo, she's the chief executive of Carbfix. She showed me around. The joint venture is with Climeworks, a Swiss startup founded by two young German engineers. And between them, they've built a system to suck carbon dioxide from the air, dissolve it in water, pump it underground into the Icelandic bedrock where it turns into limestone. So this is an extraordinary piece of technology. You're going to hear much more about them. They're already active. They've already been selling offsets to everyone from Bill Gates to the car maker Audi. It's already working, but it's expensive. To bring down costs, they need to scale up. And they need to scale up very significantly to make a significant impact on the climate. Each of their machines can absorb 50 tons of carbon dioxide a year. Global greenhouse gas emissions altogether are 50 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent each year. Now that sounds like a lot. It sounds, if you were to try and offset all of that with Climeworks machines, you'd need 1 billion of them. But then something that Christoph, one of the co-founders of Climeworks, said to me, he said, do you realize we make almost 100 million passenger cars every year as a human civilization? And these boxes are easier to make than a car. They're 2 meters cubed. So if we wanted to make 100 million of these boxes a year, obviously we could. We can make 100 million cars a year. We just have to really want to do it. And that was a very interesting remark to me. It said something about the scale on which we need to be thinking. We need to be thinking big, and also if we think big, actually we can really set our sights high. Humans are capable of quite a lot if we really focus our efforts accordingly. Finally, I want to finish with this. This is also the final chapter of the book, and I decided to end the book with Congo because I want to emphasize how complicated it's going to be to set the global economy on a more sustainable path and to tackle the climate crisis. We can do it. There is so much we can do, but it is complicated. I went to Congo because Congo is by far the world's biggest source of cobalt, and cobalt is a very important element used in electric car batteries. The vast majority of lithium-ion batteries, especially those found in electric cars, which is now the biggest source of growth for lithium-ion batteries, contain cobalt. Most of it comes from Congo. And Congo is one of the poorest countries in the world. It has the lowest per capita healthcare spending, and it doesn't have to be so poor. There's enormous amounts of natural resources. And what I saw on the ground in Congo was alarming. So most of the world's most of Congo's production is from modern industrial mines, but there is more than 100,000 people who are working in what's called artisanal mines, and this is one that I visited. This is Monique Suila. She's a micro tycoon. She bankrolled this this mine. Now she looks she's fashionably dressed. She's got a gold necklace, but she is very poor. She lives in a shack. But she had put together money from a trading business, and she's put all of it into funding these guys behind her who are digging the mine. I went down. She has two mines. I went down inside one of them. It was 30 feet deep. It was incredibly scary just getting down there with bare hands and feet. But these people, they go down there all day, every day. People like this gentleman, Gaylord Selenge, as well as people like Letitia, who I also featured in the book. There are children who have been working on these mine sites. It's incredibly dangerous. And this is one side of the energy transition that we have to pay attention to. And this does not mean that we don't need to pursue the energy transition. This does not mean that we shouldn't be developing electric cars. We have to produce electric cars. The point is that as we focus on the opportunity to build a cleaner economy and a lower carbon economy, we also have an extraordinary opportunity to build a fairer economy, one in which children like Letitia are in school. She's now, by the way, you'll see she was on a sewing machine. She's now an apprentice seamstress. She's being helped by an NGO. She should never have been working on a mine site in the first place. And this involves some really tough thinking about the way our supply chains work, the way our big international companies work abroad. The Congo is a place where the money from minerals goes missing, in large part due to the corruption of Congolese politicians, but also in large part due to the corruption of Western corporate leaders, the companies that are operating in that country, hand in glove with those politicians. So all of this together, we have an extraordinary opportunity to tackle the climate crisis. There are a lot of people doing a lot of really exciting things to do so, but it's not going to be easy. And we have to really focus on these deep questions of justice as we do so, to make sure that this is really tackled in the most equitable and most effective possible way. So I think I've slightly overrun the time allotted for the talk, but I hope we do still have time for a few questions before we wrap up.
Sure, Simon. So thanks a lot for your talk. It was so exciting, and I think you definitely adding the human color to it. We would have never thought of it that way, and it has made it really exciting for us. So definitely, we do have some questions, and maybe I'll start off with one, if I can have that privilege to do that, and maybe link it to one of the questions that has been asked by one of the participants. So it's about when we talk of net zero. So we talk of emissions, net zero emissions or energy. Should we do it that way, or should we look at it holistically, like also looking at air, soil, water, since you also talked about the water crisis? And I'll also link it to one of the questions in the chat. Nishant asked that with this climate catastrophe, even mitigation and adaptation is going to be contributing and costing dearer. Say lithium deposits, which will be under hunt for energy storage for electric vehicles. More of a trade-off, and saturation seems too far, which probably no one can predict. So what do you have to say about solutions which may look good at the face value but could actually be false climate solutions? So
Yeah.
what is your take, Simon?
Yeah, so starting with the question of net zero, yeah, we absolutely so things like the Iceland project that I mentioned, that's been quite controversial. If you speak to some people in the climate movement, they're very skeptical about negative emissions technologies. And the reason for that is that they have a concern, and I think it's a justified concern, that this could detract from the emphasis on cutting emissions. So you could have some people who would say, well, you know, we don't need to cut emissions. We'll just use that thing in Iceland and we can keep on burning coal and oil. No, obviously that's not right. We need to reduce our gross emissions as rapidly as we possibly can. But the point is, for me, already the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is too high. Before the Industrial Revolution, 280 parts per million, now well over 400. It's already too high. People have already been losing their lives and communities and livelihoods. So it needs to come down anyway. So we need both. We need to stop adding and also start reducing. I think we should do both as rapidly as possible. And as for, you know, where we deploy the resources, you know, we just need to evaluate on case by case basis, you know, where would be the most appropriate place to focus. But I absolutely think we need both. And then, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think when we look at solutions, it's absolutely not the case that anything that sounds green is good. And I think carbon offsets, for example, this is one that's complicated, especially forestry-based offsets. You'll see a lot of people, you've probably noticed very often if you try and book a flight, a lot of airlines now, they say, do you want to offset your emissions? Click here. And it will only cost you a few dollars. It's very cheap relative to the cost of the flight. Now, why is it so cheap? Well, according to many experts, the reason why the current offsets are so cheap is because they don't do what they claim. They're not really offsetting the carbon. What you're effectively doing is, with nearly all of these offsets that are on the market at the moment, you're helping to fund forest protection. So somebody owns a forest and they're saying, I'm going to protect this forest, and this forest would otherwise be cut down. So if you give me this money, you are offsetting your emissions because you're preventing the loss of this forest. But very often it's not clear that the forest would have been cut down anyway. Very often a different area of forest is cut down. So someone like Ezio, who I met in the Amazon, if you protect one area of forest, he'll just go and cut down a different area of forest. So carbon offsets, that's one example of, especially forestry-based and deforestation avoidance-based offsets. That's one really strong example of a purported climate solution that I and many others have a lot of concerns about. So I think when you hear about something that sounds green and wonderful, make sure you do your homework.
Sure. So thanks a lot, Simon. And Hemanji, if you can at least take one more question and maybe more. So actually another question. So thanks a lot, Simon, for your take on this. I mean, you said you were at the COP26 in Glasgow in November. And so India, I mean, as a country, we've pledged to become a net zero carbon emitter by 2070. And we have announced enhanced targets for renewable energy deployment as well as reduction in carbon emissions. It's like cleaner energy, but at the same time also finding ways to reduce emissions. So, I mean, what is your advice since you've traveled so many countries? So for India to achieve its goals, I mean, what are the low-hanging fruits that you see for India to achieve its goals? How do we motivate people to reduce their carbon emissions? And so there is a linked question to that as well. I'll add that. Tarun Kataria, he asked, he probably suggests, since you mentioned about this, probably the meat eating part. I mean, maybe that could relate to methane production and also, the destruction of Amazon. So what is your take? What do we do? There are so many things. Some could be offensive to others, and there are a whole host of things going on there. So what do you think about it?
Yeah, well, one thing I should mention in this context is that, as you know, India was very strongly sort of criticized by many people at COP26, and I don't think any government did everything it should have done, or any of the big governments really measured up to the task at COP26. But I thought the scapegoating of India in particular was in very bad taste, actually. This is not to say that they did everything perfectly, but the fact is, this language around the phasing down of coal, that was in the bilateral agreement between the US and China. That was published on the US State Department website. I thought it was awfully convenient for many people in the West to just blame India, especially when you consider that India and other developing countries had been promised $100 billion a year in climate-related financial support, which never materialized. So in terms of India's record, I want to point that out because I think it's important. India is really, if we look at the outlook for the global climate, India is really one of the big questions, because India could doom the climate or it could save the climate. India is so big, and its future energy demand is, whatever happens, India's energy consumption is going to be enormous. So the question of how that energy is generated really decides to a pretty significant degree the direction of travel for the global climate. Under the International Energy Agency's base case scenario, according to a report last year, India's carbon emissions between now and 2050 will go up by so much that they will cancel out all of the reductions from the European Union during that period, which would, of course, be a big problem. But the IEA also points out that it doesn't have to happen like that. That India also has, more than any other country, the most incredible potential to mitigate those emissions, because India is installing so much new capacity. So much is new that India has a huge amount of say over what direction this goes in. One thing that I'm encouraged by is that we've constantly, in India as elsewhere, we've been constantly taken by surprise by how rapidly solar power in particular has been developing. India has one of the strongest solar resources in the world. I mean, there are countries like Saudi Arabia that are just ridiculously sunny, but India is not actually that far behind. Certainly in parts of India, it would actually be quite similar. India has incredible solar resources. Wind, not as spectacular, but solar especially, it's incredible. The government has put in place very ambitious targets. As you know, Adani and Ambani are both now getting very enthusiastic about this. It's now, in my recent conversations with people in India, it's clear that to a greater extent than when I was in the country, this is now big business. This is now, people in big business are getting really excited about this. When I was in the country 2016 to 2019, it was still a bit on the margins, actually. I mean, of course, there was investment happening in clean energy, but it wasn't at the core of the corporate strategy of the big companies that I wrote about. Now it is. I think that's exciting to see. And so in terms of what you'd need to see happen for India to really play a leading role in tackling climate change, all new electricity generation needs to be zero carbon. And it's encouraging to see that there's no new coal. There's a lot of existing coal, but there's no new coal coming online because solar power is cheaper. But the big question is, how rapidly can you roll out the solar? How rapidly can you shut down those coal plants? And it's complicated because shutting down power plants in India is a very different thing from shutting down power plants in, say, the US, because the US already, has plenty of energy. So you just add some, you take some away. India has far less than it needs. India needs so much more energy for its people. So many Indian people don't have sufficient access to energy. So shutting down power plants in India, I recognize, is is much more difficult, and that's a tough question to grapple with. That's why I hope that sort of international capital will be deployed in greater quantities. And then, of course, the other big question for India, now that it's one of the very biggest vehicle markets in the world, is the electrification of vehicles in India. Scooters, it's been quite exciting to see the speed of scooter electrification in India. It shows that there's, it's not that Indians are not willing to get electric vehicles. Obviously, when it comes to passenger cars, it's still a very small market compared with some others, a few thousand cars a year, but it is growing very fast. As in other countries, it's just about getting the infrastructure in place, getting the models available on the market. I think Tata has shown leadership there. I think you just want to see that infrastructure coming into place. I think, as with people elsewhere in the world, people are very open in India to the idea of an electric vehicle, but they don't want to be stranded without an ability to recharge. And there is also the price issue. You need to make sure that it's really cost effective to do it. And those are the big questions. And it's important for India, and it's important for the world as a whole. So we'll all be watching it closely.
Thank you so much, Simon, for your advice for us. Hemanji, do we have time for more questions, or should we have to
I think
close?
it's better to close because we were overshot by 10 minutes.
Sure. So, I mean,
Okay.
Simon, so I would then just want to thank you on behalf of all of us. I mean, it was so inspiring, so exciting, and, that we are going to be thinking a lot more about it than otherwise. And there are many more questions in the chat, but I'm sure that, somehow we'll try to address them on our end, or we'll probably seek your guidance later.
Well, people are very welcome, I should say, to reach out to me through social media. You'll find me easily on Twitter, Instagram. Please do check out, if you've been interested in this, of course, please do get the book, which is available from all good retailers in India and elsewhere. It's in 40 countries, so even if you're not dialing in from India, you can find it. And there's a video series also, which you'll find on my website and on YouTube. So and please do feel free to get in touch with me with any questions or comments. I'm always happy to hear feedback.
Yeah. So thanks a lot, Simon. And actually, I would just like to add that the book I'm definitely going to read very soon, but the videos on your website, the short films, I mean, they are absolutely marvelous. So they let you know so many different perspectives, and that definitely is a must watch for all the climate enthusiasts. And I'm very sure that all the participants, you must have enjoyed Simon's talk thoroughly, and there would be so many takeaways for us from this session. And so I would like to thank everyone for participating in today's talk, and especially thank Simon from the bottom of our heart. So thanks again, Simon, and thank everyone for their time. So thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All the best.